Between 1936 and 1957, the United States manufactured roughly 5,400,000 M1 rifles. Springfield Armory delivered 3,526,922 of them through the end of the Second World War. Winchester built 513,880 more under license. Harrington and Richardson and International Harvester restarted the lines for Korea. Inside every one of those rifles was the same mechanism, drawn by a civil servant at a federal armory. A man who, in January 1936, signed over every patent he held on the design to the United States government for nothing. No royalty clause, no per-unit payment, no reservation of foreign rights. By 1942, he was the Armory's chief engineer at $8,000 a year, and that salary was the entire compensation for the most produced American service rifle of the century. In July 1941, a congressman from his own state introduced a bill to pay him $100,000 in recognition of very valuable services rendered. The bill died in committee, and no evidence survives that it was ever introduced again. The arithmetic is the story. 2 documents, 5.5 years apart. In the first, from January 1936, an inventor hands his government every right he holds in a weapon that government will go on to build by the million. In the second, from July 1941, the government's own legislature considers paying him something for it and declines. The whole of this story sits between those 2 pieces of paper. How a man came to occupy a position in which giving the rifle away was the only transaction available to him, and why the country that took it never found a mechanism for handing anything back. The explanation begins with how the trade paid everybody else. But first, the name that is not there. The rifle's official designation was approved on January 9, 1936, and it reads, in full, U.S. Rifle, caliber .30 M1. The line contains a country, a caliber, and a model number. There is no name in it. The omission is easy to read past and difficult to forget once noticed, because the American gun trade was an industry built out of surnames. Winchester was a man before it was a company. So were Colt and Remington. In that trade, a successful mechanism and its designer were the same commercial fact, and the surname on the product was the deed to the fortune the product generated. The M1 reversed the formula. Its designation named its owner, which was the United States, and said nothing at all about its author. The trade behind those surnames ran on royalties, and the mechanism of the money was simple. An independent designer who solved a hard mechanical problem did not take wages for the solution. He sold the mechanism to Winchester, Colt, or Remington, and the manufacturer paid him on every unit it built for the life of the patent. The income scaled with production, which meant that a good design was not a salary, but an estate. The work was done once, and the money arrived for as long as the patent ran, and the factories did. A designer who reserved his foreign rights could sell the same drawings again abroad. This was the standard architecture of the business, and both sides understood the terms. The manufacturer carried the risk of the factory, and the designer took a share of every gun that came out of it. Outside that arithmetic stood the man who drew the M1, and not because the work fell short. He was a federal employee at a federal armory, and under the terms of that employment, everything he drew belonged to the United States government the moment he drew it, before any patent issued, before any rifle was built. There was nothing for him to sell because he owned nothing. There was no license to negotiate because the only customer already held the title. The exclusion was not a clause somebody forgot to write. Winchester could pay royalties because Winchester sold rifles at a profit. An armory sold nothing. It was the government arming itself, and the government did not pay itself for the privilege. His compensation was a salary, and a salary does not scale with production. 500 rifles or 5 million. The paycheck was the same paper. The assignment signed in January 1936 surrendered nothing his job had not already claimed. It put a signature on an arrangement as old as his employment. That surrender's scale can be measured against the bill Congress declined to pass. $100,000, set against the rifles eventually built, works out to less than 2 cents apiece, a rate no private contract in the industry would have recorded, offered once as a gesture rather than an obligation. Even that was allowed to die. No other figure in the story states the terms quite so plainly. Jean Cantius Garand was the name the designation omits. He was born on January 1st, 1888, the first day of the year, in Saint-Rémy, Quebec, one of 12 children in a farming family, 6 boys and 6 girls, in a household that spoke French. Of the 6 brothers, he would be the only one ever to anglicize his name, and in a French-speaking household that was not a small thing. It was a direction of travel. The other 5 kept what they were given. Jean became John. The turn came in 1899, when the boy was 11. His mother died, and his father moved the children south across the border to Jewett City, Connecticut, a mill village where the work was cloth instead of land. 11 years separated the farm from the factory. A border and a language separated them further. The boy went into a textile mill at the bottom of it, sweeping floors. The English he would speak for the rest of his life he learned there, on the factory floor. His formal education ended early and never resumed. There would be no diploma and no degree behind anything he built afterward, and what he knew, the machines taught him. Before he finished school, he was already running them, and then there was no more school at all. The mill gave him a language and a trade. The trade was machines, running them, minding them, learning what they could and could not be made to do. Neither the language nor the trade was the thing that mattered most. Somewhere in those Connecticut years, before anyone thought to pay him for it, the boy began to design. The designing had a direction from the start, and the direction was accuracy. A textile mill runs on repetition. The same operation thousands of times, as fast as the machinery will bear. And the teenager who spent his days inside that rhythm was drawn, outside it, to the opposite problem, making a thing strike exactly where it is aimed. He found that problem where a Milltown boy could find it, around shooting galleries and target work, where hitting the mark is the whole of the transaction. He shot, and he studied the machinery the shooting depended on, and the mechanisms he began sketching for himself had no customer and no commission. Accuracy was not yet a trade for him. It was an appetite. In 1909, at 21, he was hired by Brown & Sharp in Providence, Rhode Island, one of the finest precision tool-making firms in America. Brown & Sharp did not make guns. It made the machine tools and measuring instruments with which other American factories made nearly everything else, and it worked to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Dimensions no eye can see and no fingertip can feel. Dimensions that exist only through measurement. In that shop, a part was not a shape. It was a set of numbers, and every number was a promise the metal had to keep. The work passed under gauges all day long, and the gauges did not negotiate. A part that missed its number by 1,000th of an inch was not nearly right. It was scrap, and the shop's authority rested on refusing to call it anything else. The boy from the textile floor entered that discipline and stayed inside it for 7 years. What Providence taught him was not invention. Any able draftsman can put a clever mechanism on paper, and the paper will not object. The question Brown and Sharp trained into him was the one the paper never answers. Whether a factory can actually cut the part with the machines it owns, at the tolerances it can hold, at a cost the order will bear, in the numbers the contract demands. A design that fails that test is not a design. It is a picture of one. The skill was called manufacturability, and it was the least glamorous competence in the trade. Nobody's name went on it, and no patent described it. It is also the skill on which the rest of this story turns. Providence did not train him to imagine a rifle. It trained him to imagine the factory that would have to build one. In 1916, he moved again, to a tool-making firm in New York. The move looks minor in the record, one machinist changing employers after 7 years, and it put him where the following year found him. In 1917, with the United States at war, the Army solicited designs for a light machine gun, and from the submissions it received, it chose his. The choice carried him out of the tool rooms altogether. He was appointed to the Bureau of Standards in Washington to perfect the weapon, a government posting for a government gun. He worked at it while the war that justified it was being fought an ocean away. The first working model was finished in 1919. The war had ended in November 1918. His first great design had missed its own war by a year, and a weapon that misses its war does not get built. The machine gun was never needed, never issued, never put into series production. It survives in this story only as a rehearsal, proof that he could carry a military mechanism from solicitation to working model, delivered to a customer who no longer required one. On November 4, 1919, Springfield Armory hired him at $300 a month. The Armory's books recorded the position as skilled laborer, a payroll heading, not a description, the nearest words the Federal Ledger had for what he was actually there to do. In 1920, he was naturalized as a citizen of the United States, and the sequence deserves to be stated plainly. He had already begun drawing the service rifle of the United States before he was legally an American. The country took the work first and admitted the workman second. In 1921, the title caught up, and he became on the books an automatic rifle designer at $3,600 a year. $300 a month is $3,600 a year. The promotion changed the wording of his file and moved the arithmetic nowhere. The Armory had renamed him without repricing him. He would stay at that bench, inside that institution, on what amounted to one problem for the next 34 years. The one problem deserves its full dimensions, because in 1919 it stood unsolved by every army on Earth. Every major power had come out of the First World War, carrying bolt-action rifles, hand-operated repeaters in which, after each shot, the firing hand leaves the trigger, grasps the bolt, unlocks it, draws it back, drives it forward, and locks it down before the rifle can fire again. The armies had not settled on the bolt out of nostalgia, and they had not settled on it for lack of alternatives because self-loading designs had been put in front of war departments for years. They had settled on it because the bolt worked and the alternatives did not. Every self-loading rifle yet offered to a military had jammed. The bolt asked almost nothing of its ammunition and forgave almost everything in the field. It merely made every rifleman slow. That was the trade every general staff in the world had accepted, and in 1919 not one of them had found a way out of it. The reasons were not mysterious. They were mechanical, and they were four. A self-loader harnesses the violence of its own firing to throw out the spent case and feed the next round. And a battlefield attacks that delicacy from every side. The action has to keep cycling through heat, as sustained fire cooks the barrel and everything attached to it. It has to keep cycling through fouling, as burned powder cakes the moving parts shot by shot. It has to keep cycling through dirt, because a service rifle lives where the soldier lives, and the soldier lives on the ground. And whatever survives all three has to come in at a weight a man can carry all day. Along with everything else, the Army has already hung on him. The requirement was not a marvel for the test stand. It was a self-loading rifle that a conscript could drop in the mud, pick up, and fire. Against that standard, every design yet offered had failed. That was the problem lying on the bench at Springfield when the skilled laborer reported in November 1919, and it was still there, unmoved. When the automatic rifle designer took it up under his corrected title in 1921, the Armory had, without ceremony, hired the man who would draw the next American service rifle. What Garand chose as his first line of attack was a mechanism almost nobody else in the field trusted, and that road would cost him years before it failed. The mechanism was called primer actuation, and it proposed to make the cartridge operate the rifle. When a round fires, the primer, the small cap at the base of the case that ignites the charge, is pushed back against the bolt by the pressure of its own detonation, and Garand set out to capture that motion and use it to unlock the action. The idea added no machinery to the outside of the weapon and asked nothing of the barrel. The energy was already there, inside every round, waiting to be collected. He pursued it through the early 1920s, model after model, tuning the mechanism to the exact behavior of the service ammunition it fired. Then, the Army changed its powder. The new propellant did not behave like the old. The timing his design depended on ceased to exist, and a scheme that had been difficult became unworkable. The work of those years was not beaten by a rival and not broken on a test range. It was voided by a supply decision made without reference to him. He discarded it and began again. The second attack ran through the barrel. Gas operation bled off a small portion of the propellant gas as the bullet passed and used its push to drive the action through the full cycle. Throw the bolt open, eject the spent case, feed the next round, lock shut again. It was the opposite wager. Where the primer offered a faint, exacting push, the barrel offered abundance. The approach was less delicate and more tolerant of the world around it, and it was the one Garand would carry to the end of his working life. But the restart surrendered time. He had been on the Armory payroll since November 1919, and the service rifle of the United States now had to be invented twice. He was also no longer the only serious name in the competition. John Peterson was an independent designer with a reputation already made, and he had entered the same trials with a rifle built on a different principle. A toggle-delayed action, its breech held shut not by a rigid lock, but by a hinged linkage that folded open under pressure at a controlled rate. Peterson's rifle required its own ammunition, a smaller cartridge, its cases coated in wax so the action could draw them from the chamber while pressure still held them tight. And the Ordnance Department took both the rifle and the man seriously. The pairing of the two designers reproduced inside a single competition the divide this story opened with. Peterson was the industry insider, the kind of designer whose mechanisms were property he could price. Garand was the Armory employee whose drawings belonged to the customer before the ink dried. If the Peterson rifle won, its designer held something to sell. If the Garand rifle won, its designer had already been bought. Both weapons were built around the same institutional bet. The Ordnance Department had committed its thinking to a new cartridge, the .276. Smaller and lighter than the .30-06 the Army had carried through the First World War. And the department regarded the new round as the old one's coming replacement. The two rifles therefore met on level ground in one caliber before the same boards. The testing consumed years. In January 1932, at the end of it, an ordnance board recommended adoption of the .276 Garand, carried in the files under the designation T3E3. A little more than 12 years after the armory put a skilled laborer on its books, the rifle had won. The victory lasted 1 month. In February 1932, the Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, ordered all work on .276 rifles and .276 ammunition stopped at once. The order was not a judgment on the weapon. Nothing in it contested what the board had found. The reasons were two, and neither was ballistic. The Army was sitting on enormous stockpiles of .30-06 ammunition, and 1932 was the worst budget year of the Depression. A service, fighting for every appropriation, was not going to walk away from the ammunition it already owned in order to start purchasing a new caliber. Nothing about the .276 had failed except its arrival. It asked for new money in the 1 year the Army had none to give. So the rifle that had just won its trials was canceled by memorandum. 12 years of development were invalidated in a sentence. Reaching the recommendation had required boards, years, and exhaustive testing. Unmaking it required one piece of paper. What Garand did next is the entirety of what the record preserves. And it is enough. He went back to the bench and rebuilt. The design around the .30-06 and the reworked rifle took the designation T1E2. He did not start from a clean sheet, and he did not walk away. He took the mechanism that had just been killed and taught it to feed the older, heavier round. The cartridge was longer and more powerful, and the mechanism had to be redrawn around it without losing what the trials had already proven. And in that rebuilding, the order that had looked like destruction became the making of the rifle. A .276, Garand would have entered service chained to a cartridge. The country would have had to begin producing from nothing. The T1E2 fed the round America already had by the billion. The memorandum had cost him his caliber and handed him in exchange every cartridge in every depot the Army owned. In March 1932, the Armory received its next order: build 80 rifles in the model shop and build alongside them the machine tools and fixtures required to mass produce the design. The second half of the order mattered more than the first. 80 hand-finished rifles prove a mechanism. Tooling proves a product. From that month forward, the rifle and its factory were one undertaking developed together, each constraining the other. And the discipline Garand had absorbed in Providence, the habit of treating the machining as part of the invention, stopped being a private competence and became the program itself. The rebuilt rifles went to the field in October 1935, and this time nothing reversed. The trials ran, the reports came back, and the Ordnance Department recommended adoption. On January 9, 1936, the Adjutant General approved standardization, and the weapon took the name it would keep: U.S. Rifle, caliber .30 M1. 4 years separated MacArthur's memorandum from that approval. 16 separated the approval from the November morning in 1919, when the Armory first put him on its payroll. With the Adjutant General's signature, the United States became the first nation on Earth to adopt a semi-automatic rifle as the standard weapon of its infantry. The problem handed across the bench in 1919, the one every army on Earth had failed to solve, had been solved by a salaried employee of a federal armory for wages, and every other army in the world was still working a bolt between shots. That same month, Garand signed over to the United States government every right he held in the design. The assignment kept back nothing. Not a royalty, not a payment tied to production, not a right in any foreign country. No bargaining preceded the signature, because his employment had left nothing to bargain over. He had turned 48 on the 1st of January, 8 days before the approval was signed, and the patent he gave away that month was the most valuable in small arms in the 20th century. In the trade that paid its designers by the unit, a mechanism like this was an estate. He signed the estate over entire and went back to work. The rifle now stood standardized, government-owned, and unbuilt in any number beyond the model shops. It had survived a powder change, a rival with a waxed cartridge, a Nationalbunds, a Reichsrange, and a memorandum from the Chief of Staff. It very nearly did not survive its own production line. The trouble was at the muzzle. As standardized in 1936, the M1 did not collect its operating gas through a hole drilled in the barrel. It caught the gas in a trap assembly fitted at the muzzle, past the end of the rifling. The arrangement had an engineering logic to it. The barrel itself stayed unpierced. And in service, it failed the two tests a service rifle cannot fail. The gas trap proved fragile, and it spoiled the rifle's accuracy. On October 26, 1939, an ordnance committee ordered the system redesigned around a conventional drilled gas port, the plain solution the trap had been contrived to avoid. The order reached backward as well as forward. Rifles already delivered were recalled and rebuilt, and production barely begun, stalled, while the armory converted what it had only just finished making. 3 years after standardization, the announced future of the American infantry was moving backward through its own factory. The rework was so thorough that the original configuration nearly ceased to exist, and the few gas trap rifles that escaped conversion are museum pieces today, rarities preserved by the accident of having been missed. The second failure came from inside the receiver, and it was worse because nothing about it could be seen. Rifles began jamming on the 7th shot of the 8-round clip, not randomly, not intermittently, but on the 7th round, with a regularity that pointed at the metal rather than the men holding it. The cause, when it was finally traced, was almost too small to state. A sliver of metal was missing from a guide rib inside the receiver, removed not by any change in the drawings, but by a change in the tooling that cut the part. The drawings were right, the rifles were wrong. The jam was not in the design at all. It was in the manufacture, which meant it had been introduced somewhere between the drawing and the machine, in territory no firing trial had ever examined. A rifle that fails on the 7th round of 8 is not a service rifle, whatever its trials proved, and the press found out. On May 29, 1940, the Senate Military Affairs Committee opened hearings on a bill to replace the M1 with a rifle designed by Melvin Johnson, a captain in the Marine Corps Reserve and a lawyer by profession, who came to Washington and testified personally. Johnson was a serious designer with a serious rifle, and he was also something the man at Springfield had never been, which was his own advocate. Fluent in the room where rifles were argued over rather than made. The Ordnance Department answered the controversy with secrecy, and the secrecy performed the way secrecy performs in front of a national press. It fed a newspaper campaign, carried across the country, asserting that the Army was hiding a defective weapon from the public that had paid for it. Into all of this, Garand said nothing. He did not testify. He did not give interviews. He did not defend the rifle, or himself, in print. He fixed the guide rib, and he redesigned the gas system, and the corrections went into the rifles while the argument about the rifles went on without him. It was the same reply he had given the memorandum of 1932, which was no reply at all, only work. The argument was settled in a place the committee had no jurisdiction over. Between December 1941 and April 1942, a campaign of roughly 4 months, the M1 fought its first sustained combat on the Bataan Peninsula of the Philippines. The regular units there had received their M1s during the reinforcement of 1941, the 31st Infantry Regiment, the 45th and 57th Regiments of Philippine Scouts, and the 26th Cavalry. The reserve divisions beside them still carried bolt-action rifles, so the peninsula held both generations of American infantry weapon at once in adjacent positions against the same enemy. that enemy had trained for the older one. Japanese infantry doctrine was built against the tempo of bolt-action fire, and that tempo was fixed: 5 rounds in the magazine, and a hand off the trigger after every shot to cycle the bolt. The pause between shots was a known quantity, and an attack could be paced against it. Against the regular regiments on Bataan, the pause was not there. What came back from the Japanese side is among the strangest compliments in the history of small arms. Japanese field reports from Bataan claimed that the Americans had issued a machine gun to every infantryman. The claim was false, and it was also the only explanation the men writing those reports had available, because nothing in their training accounted for the volume of rifle fire the American regulars were producing. The arithmetic behind the illusion was simple. A trained man with an M1 delivered 40 to 50 aimed rounds a minute. A man with an Arisaka delivered 10 to 15. But the difference did not register on the receiving end as a ratio. A platoon does not sound 3 times better. To the men advancing on it, it sounds like a different category of weapon, and the reports described exactly that, in the only vocabulary their authors had. On January 10, 1942, the 3rd Battalion of the 57th Philippine Scouts, under Lieutenant Colonel Philip Fry, repelled a Japanese attack with its Garands, and Fry wrote afterward that the firepower of a battalion armed with modern weapons was beyond his ability to describe. For a few weeks, in early 1942, on one peninsula, both sides of the line were reaching for language and failing to find it. And then, Bataan fell anyway. In April 1942, the American and Filipino force on the peninsula surrendered, the largest surrender in American military history, and the prisoners were marched north into what became known as the Bataan Death March. The rifle had terrified the army facing it, and it had not saved the men who carried it. No rifle was going to. Campaigns are not lost at the scale a rifle operates on, and this one had been lost at every other scale there was. What Bataan proved was not that the M1 won battles, because the campaign that introduced it was lost from its first week to its last. What Bataan proved was that the M1 had changed what the enemy believed it was fighting. That is a real military fact. It is also a smaller one than victory, and the distance between the two was measured out, that spring, in the men walking north. The most famous thing anyone knows about this rifle is a myth. The M1 fed from an 8-round metal clip, and when the last round was fired, the empty clip ejected with a bright metallic ring. The ping, as every account of the rifle eventually calls it. The legend holds that the sound announced to the enemy that an American was empty and that soldiers listened for it and charged the moment it rang. There is no documented case of it happening. For every veteran who repeats the story, there is a veteran who calls it nonsense. German veterans of the Normandy fighting found the idea absurd on its face. In a firefight, they could not hear the sound at all, and on the rare occasions they could, the rest of the American squad was still firing, which made charging the man who had just reloaded an unpromising proposition. Many American soldiers said they liked the sound because it told them the one thing in a firefight worth knowing immediately, which was that it was time to reload. The verdict does not need a paragraph. The ping is real. The tactic built on it is folklore. The truest measure of what the enemy actually believed sits, to this day, in the record of a Japanese naval arsenal. In 1944, at Yokosuka, Japanese engineers dismantled captured M1s and reverse-engineered them into a rifle of their own, designated the Type 4. It was the Garand mechanism rebuilt to Japanese requirements, chambered for the Japanese 7.7mm cartridge and fed by Arisaka-style clips instead of the American 8-round design. The arsenal produced parts for roughly 250 rifles and completed about 100. not one, was ever issued to a combat unit. When American occupation forces reached Yokosuka after the surrender, they found the Type 4s sitting in the arsenal, assembled and unissued, and took around 20 of them home for study. There is no stranger tribute anywhere in the record of the war. An empire that had spent the Pacific Campaign fighting Garand's rifle concluded that the only adequate answer to it was Garand's rifle, and set about building one. They ran out of time. The verdict on the mechanism the Japanese had been racing to copy was written down the following January, in a letter between two American generals. On January 26, 1945, the last winter of the war in Europe, Lieutenant General George Patton wrote to the Chief of Ordnance, Major General Levin Campbell, and set down as his considered opinion that the M1 rifle was the greatest battle implement ever devised. The sentence has followed the rifle for 80 years, and it has earned the longevity, a fighting general's professional judgment rendered in the middle of a war, addressed to the office that had armed him. It has been quoted ever since, wherever the rifle is discussed, until it has become something close to the weapon's epitaph. It also repays exact reading. The praise is absolute, and its object is an implement, a device, a made thing. The rifle is named. The man who drew it is not in the sentence at all, and in that one respect, the most famous line ever written about the M1 keeps the same silence as the rifle's official designation. Underneath that sentence, the numbers had already outgrown anything the American arms industry had ever recorded. Springfield Armory delivered 3,526,922 M1 rifles through the end of 1945. Winchester, building under license, delivered 513,880 more. The lines went quiet after the Japanese surrender, and Korea relit them. Beginning in 1952, Springfield built another 637,420 rifles. Harrington and Richardson built 428,600, and International Harvester built 337,623. Two manufacturers new to the weapon, building a design whose author had never held a license to grant anyone. Springfield's own two runs, Wartime and Korean, add to 4,164,342 rifles out of a single institution. The last M1 was built in 1957, 21 years after standardization. Across two wars, the maker's ledgers add up to roughly 5,400,000 rifles. The figure this story opened with, and this is where it pays out. That many copies of a single mechanism drawn at a single bench by a salaried federal employee. In the trade that paid its designers by the unit, a share of a run that size would have been a fortune without precedent in the industry. His share was the paycheck, and the paycheck had been settled long before. The two halves of the story meet here. The Japanese Empire, with a naval arsenal at its disposal and all the urgency of a war it was losing, could not manage to copy his rifle in time. The United States, holding the rifle, the patents, and the winning side of the same war, never managed something far simpler. Paying him for it? There was one attempt. On July 9, 1941, Representative Charles Clayson of Massachusetts, the designer's own state, introduced House Bill 5276, proposing $100,000 as additional remuneration for the very valuable services rendered. The wording had a bookkeeper's restraint. The services in question were the standard weapon of the United States infantry. $100,000 in 1941 is roughly $2,200,000 in today's money, and it is also 12 and a half years of the $8,000 salary Garand was paid. The bill died. It was the second of the two pieces of paper this story opened with, and its whole recorded history is short. Introduced in July, dead thereafter. Nothing in the surviving record settles why, So the explanation has to be reconstructed, and the likeliest reconstruction is the ugliest one. The bill arrived in the last year of the Depression, asking Congress to hand a large reward to a man who already had what most of the country had spent a decade wanting: a permanent federal job at a comfortable salary. A government engineer at $8,000 a year did not look like a man who needed rescuing. Whether that was the committee's reasoning cannot be shown. What can be shown is the outcome, which is that the bill was never passed, and no evidence survives that it, or anything like it, was ever introduced again. What the government gave him instead was metal. The Pynchon Medal came in 1939. The Holly Medal of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers followed in 1941, the same year the $100,000 bill died. Then the Meritorious Civilian Service Award, and on March 28, 1944, the Medal for Merit, the highest decoration the United States conferred on a civilian in wartime. Each of them was real recognition, conferred while he was alive to receive it, and not one of them could be deposited. An employer that could confer honor by regulation, but money only by statute, gave what it had the power to issue. It issued medals. He kept working. The same reply he had given the memorandum of 1932 and the hearings of 1940. He designed the T-20, a variant of the rifle that could be switched to fully automatic fire, and he stayed on the production side as well, where he had always been strongest. One of his manufacturing improvements raised the output of a single part from 100 pieces a shift to 750. He designed inspection gauges and a grenade launcher. None of it carried a royalty either. Everything he drew still belonged, the moment he drew it, to the same owner as before. Outside the shop, the record of the man stays thin, because he kept it thin. In winter, he flooded his own cellar, let the water freeze, and skated on the ice. A private rink under a private house. He repaired clocks. Interviewers came, over the years, to the designer of the most produced American service rifle of the century, and went away with almost nothing, because about himself he offered almost nothing. What he thought of the bill, or the medals, or the arithmetic between them, he did not say, and no interviewer ever got it out of him. The cellar ice and the clocks are most of what ever got through. He retired in 1953 on a federal pension after 34 years at Springfield Armory. He was 65. The titles had changed across those years: skilled laborer, automatic rifle designer, chief engineer, and the bench had not. A federal pension is computed from a salary, and his salary had never been computed from the rifle. 15 years later, the institution itself went. On April 30th, 1968, the Department of Defense closed Springfield Armory after 174 years of continuous operation, a line of work unbroken since 1794. The armory that owned his patents had outlasted his rifle on the standard issue line, and it closed before he did. John Garand died on February 16, 1974, in Springfield, Massachusetts, at the age of 86. He is buried at Hillcrest Park Cemetery, a few miles from the drafting room. The armory is a National Historic Site now, and much of the old campus belongs to a community college. The tooling is gone. The machine tools and fixtures that had been built alongside the design since March 1932, the half of the invention that was the factory, went for scrap. The rifle did not. Surplus M1s still go out to American civilians through a federal program, some in the original crates, some with the 8-round clips packed beside them, and the mechanism inside every one of them is unchanged from the drawings a Quebec-born mill hand redrew in 1932 after an Army memorandum had erased 12 years of his work, of everything the enterprise ever comprised. The institution, the tooling, the titles, the paper. The rifle is the only piece still doing what it was drawn to do. Somewhere on an American range this weekend, one of those rifles will fire its 8th round, and the empty clip will leave the receiver with the bright metallic ring that half the internet believes got men killed. A sound out of a rifle that made somebody rich, and the somebody was not the man who drew it.